Welcome to the deep dive.
Okay, today we're jumping straight into the Cold War. A really strange time, wasn't it? Huge global tension, these two massive powers, but no direct, large-scale fighting between them.
Exactly. You had the U.S. on one side, democracy, capitalism, and the Soviet Union on the other, communism, state control. And their ideas about how the world should run were just fundamentally opposed. That clash of ideologies, that's really the heart of it.
And that's our mission today, right? To
Yeah.
kind of get under the skin of the Cold War, not just the dates and events, but what it meant and maybe why we still feel its effects now. So let's start basic. What was the Cold War?
Well, the name itself is a big hint. It's that long period of geopolitical tension, mostly after World War II, primarily between the U.S. and the USSR and, of course, their allies. But the key thing is cold, meaning no direct massive war between the two big players.
So like a battle fought with other means.
Precisely. Ideology, politics, economics, propaganda, the space race, and importantly, these things called proxy wars. Lots of indirect conflict. Okay, so no direct superpower war, but the threat was always there, looming. I mean, the nuclear arsenals they built, it's just staggering when you look at the numbers.
Oh, it's genuinely mind-boggling. Both sides built up these enormous stockpiles. We're talking, well over 60,000 nuclear weapons between them at the peak.
60,000. Wow.
And this created this unique, terrifying situation called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea was basically if one side attacked, the other would retaliate and both would be completely destroyed.
So the very thing meant to protect you also guaranteed total annihilation if it failed.
Exactly. It was this constant background fear, this sort of low-level hum of anxiety that lasted for decades. It really shaped how people thought and lived.
Chilling. Okay, let's look at some key moments. The Berlin Blockade, 1948. What was going on there?
Right. So after the war, Germany and Berlin itself were divided. The Soviets controlled East Germany and East Berlin. West Berlin was like an island of Western control deep inside the Soviet zone. And the Soviets, well, they wanted the Western towers out. So in '48, they decided to cut off all land and water access to West Berlin. Roads, railways, canals, everything, trying to starve the city into submission, essentially.
Thinking the West would just give up.
That seems to have been the calculation. But the
Yeah.
Western allies, particularly the U.S. and Britain, they didn't fold. Instead, they launched the Berlin airlift.
Which was just incredible, wasn't it?
Absolutely astonishing. For nearly a year, day and night, planes flew in everything the city needed. Food, coal for fuel, medicine, thousands of flights a day at its peak.
Just bypassing the blockade entirely.
Exactly. It was a massive logistical effort, a huge political statement, and ultimately it worked. The Soviets eventually had to back down and lift the blockade. It showed real Western resolve.
Amazing story.
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump forward. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This one always feels like the closest call, the moment the world really stared into the abyss.
It's often called that, yeah. The single most dangerous moment, arguably. What happened was the Soviet Union, under Khrushchev, started secretly putting nuclear missiles into Cuba.
Right on America's doorstep.
Literally, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. When U.S. spy planes discovered these missile sites, it triggered this incredibly tense 13-day standoff.
Kennedy demanded they be removed.
He did. He announced a naval quarantine, basically a blockade around Cuba to stop more missiles coming in, and demanded the existing ones be dismantled. For those 13 days, the world was genuinely on the brink of nuclear war.
You just can't imagine the pressure inside those rooms in Washington and Moscow.
Absolutely. Both sides were making calculations. For the Soviets, maybe it was about balancing U.S. missiles in Turkey or projecting power. For the U.S., it was an unacceptable direct threat.
How did they step back?
It came down to intense, secret negotiations, back channels. Ultimately, a deal was struck. Publicly, the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba under UN supervision. Secretly, the U.S. agreed not to invade Cuba, and crucially, to remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey sometime later.
Wow. So kind of quid pro quo, but handled very carefully.
Very carefully. It was a terrifyingly close shave. It really highlighted the dangers of brinkmanship and maybe the importance of having some line of communication, even between bitter rivals.
A huge bullet dodged. Okay, different kind of competition.
Yeah.
The space race.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like science, but it was much more than that, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. Yes, there was genuine scientific interest, but it was also a massive PR battle, a key front in the Cold War. It was about demonstrating technological superiority, which was seen as reflecting the superiority of your political system.
And the Soviets scored the first big win, right? with Sputnik.
They did. 1957 Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. That was a huge shock in the West, especially in the U.S. It created this fear that America was falling behind technologically, even militarily.
Kicked off a huge reaction in the U.S.
Absolutely. Massive investment in science education, the creation of NASA. It really spurred the U.S. effort. And the ultimate goal became putting a man on the moon.
Which they achieved in '69.
Neil Armstrong. That was seen as the decisive victory in the space race for the U.S. A huge moment, broadcast globally. So yeah, rockets and satellites became symbols of national power and prestige.
It's funny how much tech we use today actually spun off from that intense competition.
True, the technological legacy is enormous. Okay, and then there were the proxy wars. You mentioned them earlier. Can you unpack that a bit more? What exactly were they?
Right, so given the MAD situation, direct war between the U.S. and USSR was unthinkable. So instead, they often fought indirectly by supporting opposing sides in conflicts elsewhere in the world.
So American allies fighting Soviet allies with backing from the superpowers.
Exactly. The U.S. and USSR would provide money, weapons, training, advisors, everything short of sending their own main armies to fight each other directly.
Can you give some major examples? Sure. The Korean War in the early 50s is a classic case. The U.S. led a UN coalition supporting South Korea against the Communist North, which was backed by the Soviets and, significantly, China.
And Vietnam, of course.
Vietnam is perhaps the most prominent and painful example for the U.S. A long, brutal conflict where the U.S. backed South Vietnam against the Communist North, which was supplied by the USSR and China. And then there's Afghanistan in the 80s, where the U.S. famously supported the Mujahideen fighters against the Soviet occupation.
So these regional conflicts became battlegrounds for the global Cold War rivalry.
Absolutely. Often with devastating consequences for the countries actually involved. Millions died in these proxy wars, and many regions were destabilized for decades, all fueled by this larger superpower struggle.
It really shows how far the ripple spread. So bringing it to today, why does the Cold War still matter? It ended over 30 years ago. Sometimes feels like ancient history.
That's a fair question, but its legacy is, well, it's everywhere. It fundamentally shaped the geopolitical map we see today. Take NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Formed to counter the Soviets.
Exactly. And it's still a major pillar of international security, arguably more relevant now than it has been in years. Or look at the division of Korea. North and South Korea are still technically at war, a direct result of that Cold War division. It remains a really dangerous flashpoint.
And the U.S.-Russia relationship today? You can definitely feel the echoes of the Cold War there, can't you?
Without a doubt. The mistrust, the competition for influence, the historical baggage, a lot of that dynamic has roots in the Cold War era, even if the ideologies aren't quite the same.
And beyond politics. Culturally, too.
Oh, massively. Think about spy movies. James Bond is basically a Cold War creation. So many thrillers, books, TV shows still draw on those themes of espionage, paranoia, ideological conflict. It's deeply embedded in our popular culture. Even video games constantly revisit it.
That's true. The spy genre is still huge. And you mentioned something earlier. Dolphins. The U.S. Navy training dolphins. Seriously.
Yes. It sounds bizarre, right? But it's true. The U.S. Navy did, and I believe still does to some extent, train dolphins and sea lions for things like mine detection or locating enemy swimmers or submarines. It just goes to show the lengths each side went to, exploring every possible avenue, however unconventional, to gain some kind of edge. It wasn't all just missiles and diplomacy. There was some pretty weird stuff going on, too.
Trained dolphins. Okay, that's one for the pub quiz. Right, we've covered a huge amount. Could we maybe boil down the essence of the Cold War into, say, 3 key points for everyone listening?
Sure, let's try. Okay, first, it was that big, decades-long rivalry between the U.S. and the USSR after World War II. Clash of superpowers, clash of ideologies.
Was one.
2. It was fought indirectly through politics, economics, propaganda, arms races, the space race, proxy wars, but crucially not direct, large-scale fighting between the two main players, hence cold.
Okay, indirect conflict. 2.
And 3, the defining backdrop to almost all of it, for nearly half a century, was the constant, terrifying threat of nuclear war. Mutually assured destruction hanging over everything.
Right. Superpower rivalry, indirect conflict, nuclear threat. That sums it up pretty well. Okay, so for our final thought for you, the listener, something to chew on. If you could be an invisible observer back in time during the Cold War, What specific moment, what single interaction or decision between the leaders would you want to witness firsthand? And why? What key moment do you think really unlocks an understanding of that whole era?
That's a great question because so much hinged on those closed-door moments, those individual choices.
Exactly. Food for thought. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of the Cold War.
My pleasure.
Next time, we're shifting focus to another critical period, Germany, from 1890 to 1945. We'll be looking at the path from a new nation to democracy, and then, tragically, to dictatorship. Expect big mustaches and even bigger consequences. Hope you can join us then. Until next time, keep exploring.